You learned to love the cold because it numbed the ghosts. But as the Atlantic surged and granite pinned your leg, silence became a death sentence. Now, you'll discover if a broken warrior can truly be saved again. Elias Thorne doesn't wake up to an alarm. He wakes up to the suffocating silence of four-a-muter, a habit carved into his bones by 2 decades of serving in units that technically don't exist. In the dim, blue light of a Maine morning, he doesn't reach for a phone. Instead, his feet hit the floor with a muffled thud, and he immediately begins his reps. 42 years old, and his body still moves with the serrated efficiency of a combat knife. He counts in his head, his breathing a controlled, rhythmic hiss. Each movement is a ritual, a mechanical attempt to outrun the ghosts that ride the salt-heavy air of Raven's Cove. Outside, the Atlantic grinds against the granite teeth of the coast, a relentless, churning gray that mirrors Elias's internal landscape. His cabin is a fortress of strategic minimalism. There is a bed, a wood stove, a topographical map of the coastline pinned to the wall, and a single, empty nylon K9 harness hanging by the door. He doesn't look at it, yet he can't bring himself to move it. He moves through the town like a shadow, the man who fixes the heavy diesel engines no one else can figure out. He is a phantom among the living, watching the horizon from the pier while the local fishermen share stories he will never be part of. They call him the Commander, a nickname born of his rigid posture and the 1,000-yard stare that seems to see through the very cliffs they stand on. He spends his afternoons patrolling the jagged ridgeline of Raven's Gap, a series of natural stone sluiceways that drain snowmelt into the sea. He knows every treacherous patch of black ice and every shifting stone. He trusts the granite because it doesn't lie, and he trusts the cold because it's the only thing that numbs the scars on his soul. In his pocket, his fingers constantly find a scorched brass identification tag, the edges melted and the name worn smooth. He never explains why his heart rate spikes at the sound of a distant bark or why he carries that piece of fused metal like a talisman. It is a silent open loop of grief that anchors him to this desolate shore. But today, the air feels like static. The barometer is plummeting, and the clouds are bruising into a violent purple. Up on the ridge, the yellow machinery of the Atlantic Corporation is already idling, marking the earth for a project that defies the laws of the tide. Elias feels the prickle on his neck, the warning of an impending strike. He grabs his keys, the internal alarm of a soldier screaming that something is wrong. As he pulls his truck onto the slush-covered road, the sky breaks open, and he has no idea that a collision with fate is coming, and silence is about to become a death sentence. The snap doesn't come from the gale-force winds or the churning gray surf of the Atlantic below. It's a dry, tectonic groan that vibrates through the soles of Elias's boots, a sound that warns of a structural betrayal. In an instant, the rhythmic safety of his dawn patrol is shattered. Above the gap, the saturated ridgeline, destabilized by the Atlantic Corporation's heavy machinery, finally surrenders. Shale, ice, and frozen mud cascade down the slope in a sudden, deafening rush, and Elias, moving with the jagged reflexes of a combat veteran, lunges for the relative safety of a granite overhang. He is fast, the lethal, honed product of 2 decades of elite Navy SEAL training, but the mountain is faster. A massive slab of gray granite stone, the size of a workbench and weighing nearly half a ton, shears off the cliff face with a terrifying roar. It hits the ground with a sickening wet thud that echoes through his narrow prison, catching Elias's left leg just above the boot line and pinning him against the unyielding wall of the sluiceway. The pain isn't an immediate explosion. It starts as a dull, heavy thrumming that rapidly sharpens into a white-hot blade of agony. He doesn't scream. His lungs are too busy fighting for oxygen, but his jaw muscles bulge like knotted rope as he forces himself into a cold, rapid-fire tactical assessment. He is 5 miles from the nearest human soul. His VHF radio is now a crushed knot of plastic, and the barometer is screaming. The cold he once sought as a numbing sanctuary now turns predatory. As the rain transitions into a freezing, horizontal sleet, Elias reaches into his pocket, his fingers trembling as they brush against the scorched identification tag. For the first time, the open loop finally snaps shut. The tag belonged to Jax, the Belgian Malinois who had taken the full face of a pressure plate IED in a dusty canyon half a world away so Elias could live. The empty harness by the door back at the cabin wasn't a memorial, it was a daily indictment. Elias had survived because a warrior on 4 legs had sacrificed everything, and now, pinned under the indifferent weight of the Maine coast, the debt felt impossible to repay. But as the Atlantic surges upward, the first icy fingers of the tide beginning to swirl around his trapped boot, a sound pierces the roar of the storm. It isn't the wind. It's a low, guttural, and heart-wrenching whine, echoing from a narrow crevice just 10 feet away. A pair of panicked amber eyes catches the dim light, a German Shepherd, gaunt and shivering, its fur matted with frozen salt, trapped behind a mesh of fallen timber. The loop of his grief has just been replaced by a much larger, more lethal geometry. The tide is coming, the granite is unyielding, and for the first time in his life, Elias realizes that the silence isn't a death sentence for him alone. The path back to his quiet fortress is gone, buried under a mountain of stone and the rising, predatory, and icy breath of the sea. The Atlantic doesn't care about medals or the weight of a man's regrets. It is a blind, ancient force, and right now it is claiming Elias Thorne with a thief's efficiency. The water is no longer a mist. It has become a heavy, dark shroud rising steadily around his ribs, leaching the heat from his core until his bones feel brittle. Every breath is a labor, his lungs compressed by the pressure of the half-ton granite slab and the tightening grip of the freezing Maine sleet. The agony in his pinned leg has transitioned into a deep, hollow ache, a signal from a limb that is already surrendering its life to the deep. He reaches out for a handhold, but there is only the slick slime of seaweed and the mocking smoothness of stone. He was a master of extraction, a specialist in the impossible, yet here he is nothing more than a ghost in waiting. He looks across the narrow sluiceway at the German Shepherd. The animal has stopped its scratching. Its matted head rests on a piece of salt-crusted driftwood, those wide amber eyes fixed on Elias with a silent understanding. It is a mirror he cannot bear to look into. It's the exact same gaze Jax gave him in that dust-choked canyon, a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. Elias's fingers find the scorched brass tag in his pocket. It feels colder than the Atlantic. He realizes that the fortress of silence he built back at the cabin wasn't strength. It was a rehearsal for this. He had cut himself off from the world, thinking he was protecting others. Now he realizes he was simply a coward, hiding from the painful debt of being alive. "Why now?" he whispers, his voice swallowed by the roar of the gale. He had survived the IEDs and the midnight ambushes, only to be executed by the earth itself. He starts to laugh, a dry sound that turns into a cough. He had spent his life waiting for a redemption that never came, praying to a God he only spoke to when the bullets were flying. He looks at the bruise-colored sky, searching for a sign, but the clouds offer only stinging ice. He feels the tide lick at his chin. The dog lets out a soft, broken whimper, a sound of pure loneliness that shatters Elias's iron resolve. He closes his eyes, letting his head fall back, ready to let the gray water take the man the world had already forgotten. He is finally ready for the silence. But then, amidst the thunder of the crashing surf and the terminal cold, something happened that no amount of elite training could have ever prepared him for. The Atlantic didn't just taste of salt, it tasted of a bitter, final surrender. As the freezing foam licked at the corners of Elias's mouth, the gray world began to flicker at the edges of his vision blurring into a soft, inviting darkness. But then, it happened. Not a thunderclap, but a sound so precise it sliced through the chaos of the storm like a scalpel. It was a bark, not the desperate yelp of a drowning stray, but the sharp, disciplined, 3-note alert of a military working dog. The sound vibrated through the marrow of Elias's bones, a frequency he hadn't heard in years, yet knew better than his own name. He forced his eyes open. Salt stung and heavy. Across the sluiceway, the German Shepherd had hauled its front paws onto a floating timber. Its amber eyes were no longer wide with panic. They were locked onto his with a fierce, unwavering intensity. For a fleeting second, the heavy sleet broke. A single, needle-thin ray of golden sunlight pierced the iron-gray canopy of the storm, striking the stagnant water and reflecting off the scorched brass tag still clutched in Elias's numb fingers. The name, Jax, flared in the light, a blinding spark of gold that seemed to ignite the very air. In that reflection, Elias didn't see a dead partner or a lost mission. He saw a mirror. The dog wasn't just a victim. It was a brother-in-arms calling him back from the wire. The realization hit him with more force than the granite slab. He had spent years trying to pay a debt to the dead by burying himself alive, but the debt wasn't meant to be paid in silence. It was meant to be paid in service. The empty harness in his cabin wasn't an indictment. It was an invitation. Jax hadn't died so Elias could become a ghost. Jax had died so that Elias could remain the shield. The why me that had haunted him for a decade finally evaporated, replaced by a cold, tactical clarity. There was no magic here, only the sudden, sharp memory of his training, the mechanics of leverage, the physics of survival, and the unbreakable code of the teams. The air grew lighter. The suffocating weight on his chest didn't vanish, but it became a problem to be solved rather than a sentence to be endured. His breathing narrowed into a rhythmic, controlled cycle. He looked at the dog. "I've got you," Elias rasped. His hands, once trembling with cold, moved with a sudden, jagged purpose. He reached out and gripped a thick, salt-cured oak beam that had been wedged into the rocks by the tide. He didn't ask for the stone to move. He became the force that would move it. He jammed the beam deep into the crevice beneath the granite, feeling the rough grain bite into his palms. He didn't see the Atlantic anymore. He saw a fulcrum. He saw a mission. One life for another. 2 legs and 4. The golden light on the brass tag pulsed like a heartbeat. He braced his body, his eyes locked on the amber gaze across the water. One final breath. One final push. Elias's muscles, once paralyzed by the freeze, now burn with a frantic, focused heat. He ignores the white-hot scream of his nerves, hammering the oak beam into the crevice with the heel of his palm until the skin splits. Every movement is a tactical sequence reclaimed from a past he tried to bury. He leans his weight onto the lever. The wood groans. The granite remains indifferent, a billion-year-old anchor. "Move, you bastard," he snarls, his voice cracking with salt. The first obstacle hits with the force of a physical blow. The oak fractures under the immense pressure. A sharp gunshot crack echoes off the wet cliffs. If it snaps, the mission ends. Elias adapts. He finds a heavy quartz wedge and kicks it into the widening maw with his free foot. His vision swims in shades of gray and red, but the cold is no longer his master. He is the one dictating the terms. Suddenly, he isn't in Maine. He's back at the Bud S pool, lungs screaming, a heavy weight strapped to his chest. "Don't look at the surface, Thorne. Focus on the next inch." The instructor's voice is a jagged blade in his mind. "The water is just a medium. You are the weapon." He snaps back. The Atlantic is swirling around his neck now, tasting of iron. Across the sluiceway, the German Shepherd struggles to keep its snout above the rising chop, paws slipping off the driftwood. Elias doesn't panic. He uses his teeth to pull his belt tight, creating a makeshift harness to brace his torso. This isn't a man waiting for the end. This is an operator conducting an extraction. He shifts his grip, finding a deeper pocket for the lever. The granite shudders. A grinding sound vibrates through his ribs. The pressure on his leg shifts from a crushing weight to a localized agony. It's progress. His movements are sharp and economical. He breathes in time with the surge, timing his strength with the buoyancy of the tide. The beam bows, reaching its breaking point. The gap opens 2 inches. He claws at the cold silt beneath his shin, clearing a path for his release. The dog barks a sharp, disciplined encouragement that cuts through the gale. Elias grunts, the stone tilting another fraction. But the ocean isn't finished. A massive swell builds on the horizon, a wall of dark glass topped with foam. It's coming for them. Elias braces the beam, knuckles white, mind a singular point of focus. He has found the will. But as the shadow of the wave falls over them, the ultimate question remains. Will this be enough? The wall of dark glass didn't just break, it detonated. The Atlantic roared with the fury of 1,000 cannons as the swell slammed into the narrow sluiceway, a crushing weight of ice and salt. Elias didn't pray. He didn't scream. He simply became an anchor. As the freezing foam swallowed him, he felt the oak beam beneath his hands splinter into a dozen jagged teeth. The pressure on his trapped leg intensified to a white-hot needle of agony, and then a sickening, hollow pop. The granite slab shifted just enough, lifted by the same massive buoyancy that was trying to drown him. He was free. He surged upward, his head breaking the surface into a violent world of gray spray and jagged rock. His boots found purchase on a slick, barnacle-encrusted ledge. The shore, the solid, safe, unyielding earth, was less than 10 feet away. He could crawl. He could drag his mangled leg to the safety of the tall grass and watch the storm from the warmth of a life he had finally reclaimed. Every survival instinct he possessed roared in his ears, a siren call of self-preservation. "You're out, Thorne. You did enough. Let the ocean have its ghost. Save yourself." He looked at the land, the promise of breath and heat. Then he turned. The same wave that had liberated him had played a crueler trick on the German Shepherd. The timber was gone, smashed into driftwood. The dog was a dark, frantic shape in the churning white foam, being sucked backward by the receding tide toward the devil's throat, a jagged aperture in the rocks where the sea roared into a labyrinth of underwater caves. There was no coming back from there. The dog wasn't barking anymore. It was fighting, muzzle held high, paws clawing at the liquid air. Its amber eyes locked onto Elias. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was the steady, unwavering gaze of a soldier waiting for the order to hold the line. Brother in arms. Elias stood on the edge of the abyss. His leg was a useless, throbbing weight, the muscle shredded and the bones screaming. If he went back into that churn, there was no lever to save him. There was no tactical advantage. There was only the cold, mathematical certainty of a grave beneath the Atlantic. He looked at the safe path, the dry rocks. He looked at the retreating muzzle of the dog. He didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the cost or the debt of the past. He stopped paying for the dead and started fighting for the living. "Not on my watch," he spat, his voice lost in the gale. He didn't fall. He launched. He hit the water in a perfect, disciplined combat dive, ignoring the explosion of pain in his thigh as he cut through the surface. The rip current tried to hollow him out, but he swam with a lethal violence he hadn't felt since the SEAL teams. He reached out, his fingers clawing through the foam until they found the thick, wet fur of the dog's neck. He locked his arm around the animal's chest, pulling it into a crushing, unbreakable embrace. The next wave hit. It was a mountain of iron-colored water, taller than the last. Elias didn't fight the swell. He wrapped his free arm around a submerged pillar of stone, anchored himself to the earth, and pulled the dog's head into the hollow of his shoulder. They went under together. Darkness swallowed them both. But as the ocean tried to tear them apart, Elias Thorne finally felt the weight of his own shadow dissolve. He wasn't just a man who survived. He was the shield that held. Courage walks on 2 legs, and 4. The silence inside the cabin has changed. It is no longer the hollow, ringing void of a man waiting for his own clock to run out. Now, the air is thick with the scent of cedar smoke, brewing coffee and the honest, musk-heavy smell of a wet dog drying by the fire. Elias Thorne sits in his chair, his right leg stretched out and locked in a heavy medical brace, a mapping of scars and surgical steel beneath his denim. The granite slab had taken his mobility for a season, but it had failed to take the soul he rediscovered in the freezing dark. Beneath his hand, the German Shepherd, now known as Jax, shifts his weight. The dog doesn't lie across the room. He stays pressed against Elias's good leg, a constant, living anchor. When the tide had dragged them toward the devil's throat, Elias had made a choice that defied every law of survival he'd ever been taught. He had chosen the dog over the shore. He had chosen the brother over the breath. And in that moment of absolute selflessness, the ghosts that had haunted his sleep for a decade finally went quiet. They had seen enough. They saw that the warrior was finally ready to protect something other than his own chronic pain. The open loops of his life are finally drawing closed. He doesn't look at his old uniform hanging in the closet with regret anymore. He looks at it as the armor that prepared him for this singular, impossible rescue. He isn't a retiree waiting for the end. He's a man with a purpose that walks on 4 legs. The heavy silence of the Maine woods, which once felt like a prison, now feels like a sanctuary. He no longer needs the cold to numb him because he finally has something worth feeling. In this peak of hard-earned warmth, Jax looks up, his amber eyes reflecting the dancing orange flames of the hearth. He lets out a soft huff, resting his heavy chin on Elias's knee. It is the ultimate heartwarming payoff, the silent, unbreakable contract between 2 survivors. The hook that once whispered that the cold was his only sanctuary has been proven wrong. The silence that was once a death sentence has become a sanctuary of peace. Elias reaches down, scratching Jax behind the ears, feeling the strength in the animal's neck. He is no longer the broken warrior seeking the numb. He is the man who walked into the abyss and brought back a reason to stay. Because as the embers glow, he realizes that the greatest victories aren't won on a battlefield, but in the quiet decision to let the light back in. The frost on the window pane is a decoration now, not an enemy. It is the realization that even the most shattered soul can find its center again, as long as there is a partner to hold the line. Elias Thorne is finally home. Elias Thorne did not find his way home by merely reaching the dry rocks of the Maine coast. He found it by choosing to be the shield for a soul that could not save itself. His journey reminds us that the lingering grief of yesterday and the unspoken fears of tomorrow are not meant to be carried in isolation, nor are they meant to be buried in the cold. We often believe that healing is the total absence of pain, but as Elias feels the steady, breathing weight of the dog at his side, we see a deeper truth. Healing is the moment your strength is needed more by someone else than it is by your own sorrow. When he stopped paying the debt of the dead and started fighting for the living, the Atlantic didn't just spare his life, it restored his soul. In the quiet stretches of your own life, what are the storms that keep you anchored to the dark? Perhaps you, too, have felt the numbing frost of a season that seems to have no end, or walked through a valley where the silence felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. We all have a devil's throat in our history, a place where we feared the tide would finally pull us under. Ask yourself, who is standing in the surf of your life right now, waiting for you to reach out? Is there a soul, perhaps on 2 legs or 4, that needs the warrior in you to stand up one more time? We often wait until we are whole to be useful, forgetting that the light finds its way into the world through the very cracks of a shattered soul. There is a profound, quiet grace in the understanding that our lives are most significant when they are lived for the sake of another. It is a faith defined not by loud words, but by the disciplined, selfless dive into the freezing unknown. It is the belief that we are never truly lost as long as we are willing to be found by those who need our protection. The most enduring victories aren't won on the battlefields of the world, but in the simple, flickering warmth of a hearth shared with a faithful companion. Sometimes, redemption doesn't arrive as a calm sea. It arrives as a second chance wrapped in wet fur and an unwavering amber gaze. The storm passes. The fire remains. The scars stay. But they don't ache as much when someone is there to share the watch. Listen to the silence in your own home tonight. Is it a void, or is it a peace? A heart does not need to be perfect to be a sanctuary. It only needs to be open. Elias found his reason to stay in the eyes of a partner who didn't care about his medals or his past, only his presence. We are all just survivors seeking the warmth, looking for a reason to hold the line against the cold. Courage isn't the absence of the dark. It is the choice to be the light for someone else while you are still standing in the shadows. Because in the end, true courage walks on 2 legs and 4. Stories like Elias Thorne's don't end here, proving that even a broken warrior can be saved when he finds a reason to stand up one more time. If you want to see what happened next and discover more stories that might change how you see everything, subscribe.